Hey there YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times, welcome to my channel, welcome to another episode of Total War Warhammer. So today we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about one of the counter systems that exist in the game, and it's sort of why certain infantry units are more or less viable in certain situations. And as the meta sort of shifts around, it's going to make it really difficult to spam out single unit types by contrast to what we would normally see. So if we take a look at some of the attributes of these units, you'll see that armored and armor piercing are things that come up in quite a lot of situations. If we take a look, for example, at these Graveguard, they've got armored and armor piercing. If we look at these Karen race, they've got armor piercing, but not armored. Their armor, in fact, is 0. And if we look at Graveguard, they've got armored and do not have armor piercing. So what does this all really mean? Well, ultimately, what armor piercing means is that if we look at the armor piercing damage of this Graveguard unit with these swords, they deal 8 armor piercing damage. But if we were to compare it to these Graveguard with the great weapons, these guys deal 26 armor piercing damage. So there's a big difference between different unit types in how much armor piercing damage they do, and that's all that armor piercing indicates. It means that that unit has a high armor piercing damage statistic. Armored, similarly, just means that they've got a very high armor statistic. It isn't actually a special rule in any way, it just means that a statistic is particularly high. But it's a good indicator of what those sort of units do and what you're going to need to beat them. So for example, if we were to take a look at this Graveguard unit with its armor of 90 and its decent weapon strength, if you were to throw units against it that were not armor piercing, let's say if I go over to the greenskins here and I took this unit of Savage Orc Biggins, they're damage dealers, sure, but their weapon strength being really, really high doesn't matter too much because their armor piercing damage of 12 isn't super high. That's not really great. Their armor is 0, so that means that the Graveguards are going to be able to deal full damage through that, making the Graveguard likely to win that fight. Now, Savage Orc Biggins are a very, very good unit, all in all, but ultimately, I think that that would be a very effective counter to them. One of the more sort of obvious counters is if you take Savage Orc Biggins and put them against something like the Iron Breakers with its massive armor of 120, with its decent weapon strength, very, very high melee defense, and decent melee attack. They will grind through Savage Orc Biggins very, very slowly, but they will never break against them, essentially, because the Savage Orc Biggins just can't kill them, basically. So you get into these situations where you have to pay attention to what your opponent is going to have. If we were to look at our Dwarf army here, these guys all have very high armor values, with 80 being one of the lower ends. Yes, they've got the Slayers with 0 armor, but for the most part, you can assume that a Dwarf unit is going to have 80 armor, a very, very high value, meaning that if you're up against them, having armor piercing as a trait is going to be something that you're going to definitely want. By contrast, if you're up against Bretonnia, it's a little bit more iffy because while all of their knights that they're realistically going to be taking are armored, you know, the Mountie Yeomen are not, but the actual knights are all armored, making them fairly durable units all in all. And it makes it harder to sort of just kill them outright. But if you're up against lots of Bretonnian infantry, they're not armored. They only have 40 armor, which is quite low. So, you know, similar thing with the Empire, they're more likely to have a little bit of armor because the greatswords, but mostly it's the cavalry that has the heavy armor values. 120 on some of them, 130 on the Demigryph Knights and so on and so forth, 100 on those Empire Knights. So those units, very, very heavy armor. You'll need something armor piercing to easily kill them. And by contrast, they've got decent armor-piercing units themselves, the halberdiers, the greatswords, and the handgunners. All of those can decently crack through armor. So why would you ever take something that's not armored? Well, if we take a look at, for example, the vampire counts... Well, actually, let's look at the warriors of chaos. They're Forsaken over here are heavily armored. They cost 750. Very, very good offensive statistics. But if we look at these non-armored Chaos Marauders, you know, they've only got 15 armor. They've got much less statistics all in all, but their melee attack, if you look at their sort of melee statistics, there shouldn't be this much of a price disparity based on just those sort of abilities, although the weapon damage actually probably should be that sort of disparity because of that. But ultimately, like, the Marauders, because they're not armored, are a lot cheaper. If they had a heavy armor version of the Marauder with these same statistics here, that version of the Marauder would cost a lot more without necessarily being any better at offense. So if you're up against armor-piercing weapons, like let's say that I'm fighting against these Chosen with great weapons with their very high armor-piercing damage. If we look here, armor-piercing damage of 32. If I'm fighting against that, paying for armor is kind of a fool's errand because they're going to ignore it for the most part anyway. So the Chaos Marauder actually becomes a fairly cost-effective way of dealing with something that's wielding that great weapon. So, because you're not paying for all that armor, you can have more units on the board, and their armor penetrating value doesn't matter against your non-armored units. Similarly, if I take these armored units, I might find myself up against a whole ton of armor penetrating units, so the converse also applies. And if I'm taking why would I not take all armor piercing weapons then, just in case I encounter armor? Well, again, you can see that this Chaos Marauder unit with a great weapon, it's 100 points more than this unit of Chaos Marauders normal. And if we compare their statistics, the Chaos Marauders are actually a little bit stronger, the regular ones, in most respects. They've got a little bit higher melee weapon strength, and melee attack, I believe, is slightly higher as well, yes, as is melee defense, which is quite a bit higher. And they've got the shields, which protect them a little bit against arrows. So if we were to compare units that have those great weapons, if they're fighting unarmored units, they're wasting those points. So you want to have the best combination of skills for what you're actually fighting against. And this is why this game is going to be a little bit harder to pin down in terms of meta. Like, we know if you're up against dwarves that you'll be taking armor-piercing weapons. That's just going to be a part of fighting dwarves because all their units are armored. But beyond that, what are you really going to be taking? If you take lots of heavy armor, are you just banking on the fact that your opponent will not take any armor-piercing? If you take tons of non-armored units, are you assuming that your opponent is just going to take tons of armor-piercing great weapons? It kind of flip-flops between that depending on what your opponent is going to be doing. And it might be a good idea to make sure that you've got a sort of mix of both elements in your army. The non-armor-piercing sort of for the bulk, the armored units for where you really need to sort of tie down an area, and armor-piercing units for when you need to break through an area. So it can really vary. So we're going to go ahead and get into a battle here and try and find a good example of this. So ultimately, you want to make sure that you're picking these depending on what army you have as well as your opponent. There's going to be a little bit of mind games back and forth here. For example, if I'm playing as dwarves, I know that my opponent is going to probably be taking a lot of armor-piercing weapons. If I take Warriors of Chaos, in fact, I'm pretty sure that my opponent is going to take a lot of armor-piercing weapons. So depending on who he picks, that could really be indicative of something. So we've got dwarves on our opponent's team here. So we're going to take Kolek Sun Eater just because I think he's kind of fun to take from time to time. But we're going to go ahead and he switched over to Empire. Well, we'll see what he sort of stabilizes on. But we'll take a nice little sort of front line of Marauders. I think just 4 of them actually ought to do. If he's taking Empire, then we can assume that he'll look at my force and be like, okay, we'll take some. We don't really need a lot of. Or he's going to think we do need a lot of armor piercing, so that makes these Marauders a little bit more economical against great weapons and stuff like that, but they'll still lose against the great Imperial greatswords. He'll have his own armored units. He'll have excellent cavalry, so I can take a couple of these units of Chaos Halberds, and they'll make excellent screens against cavalry as well as decent counters against armored units. We can go ahead and take some of our own Chaos Knights. They're extremely powerful but very, very expensive. We're going to stick with them for now before I get into the monsters, because that sort of is its own thing. But this sort of composition against Empire works out relatively okay. We'll see sort of if he's sticking with... It looks like he's sticking with Empire. So we'll take a couple more Marauders. I think that they are pretty decent. Actually, no. You know what we're going to take is Forsaken, actually. Since I don't need the armor piercing against everything that he's going to take, and these guys are actually really, really strong. So we're going to go ahead and take a couple of them. Might even want just a Chaos Warrior unit, but we'll probably go ahead and... Yeah, we'll go ahead and take 2 more of these guys. So we got lots and lots and lots of Chaos Marauders. We've got some punch-through units with those Forsaken. We've got some Chaos Halberdiers to try and counter his cavalry. If he's got Demigryph Knights, for example, I don't want them fighting Kolek. If he's got lots of spears or something like that, then, I don't really care about that, but we'll see what it is. Now, of course, he does also have the option to have lots and lots of missile units, but that's kind of not a great idea against this. Because, like, my squishy unit that doesn't have armor is shielded, so he could take lots of guns and then focus fire them against my heavier armored halberdier units. But looks like my opponent has taken halberdier, so he's gone for the more expensive option that's got armor piercing, which is, again, a bit of a mistake. You don't want to do that against a person who's taken a lot of those Marauders, because that sort of... They're 250 cheaper for the Marauder. It's much more cost efficient. Even though the Halberdier is a stronger unit, they're not stronger by enough to justify that sort of change in cost. And we'll see what else they've sort of got there. Halberdiers are actually an excellent unit, and I really like them, but that's only because there's a lot of people who seem to like taking monsters so far, so they're a good counter for that, but we'll get into that later. In fact, normally if I'm playing Chaos, I would want to take monsters. Monstrous creatures like Chaos Spawn or something like that, they're very, very powerful. And I think that not having them for these simple demonstrations is a little bit hamstringing, but it's not too bad. Yeah, so my opponent does have greatswords, which I did expect. Which, you know, it's not too bad. Kolek is a really good choice to use against those greatswords, but the thing about Chaos Marauders is that even though they're going to have a really hard time killing those guys, is that the Forsaken are probably going to be able to do okay against them, I think. Like, theoretically, they should counter Forsaken, but I think Forsaken will do okay just because they're ridiculous stats in general. Even though they're not armor-piercing, the weapon strength is just so high. Like, 14 armor-piercing damage, pretty low, but their damage that does get through the armor from their base values is going to be, like, enough. Especially combined with, like, Frenzy. Because these guys do sometimes sort of Frenzy. Alright, so let's go ahead and put our guys up here. Let's go ahead and hit start battle and see what happens. We'll want to be pressed up as much as possible. If our opponent has lots of artillery or something, then we want to get in there as fast as possible. So these these Chaos Warriors with halberds, we mostly want to use them to counter our opponent's cavalry. We want to use our cavalry to get around the flanks of our opponent. Like, I don't actually know how much anti-armor these guys have. Anti-armor piercing damage on Chaos Knights is actually pretty low, I kind of figured, but, you know, that's fine. Got armor piercing on Kolek over here, which is pretty decent. His damage is 520, so armor piercing damage of 400. I think he one-shot kills things. That's pretty insane, but did kind of expect that as well, so. He's a really big, nasty guy. That's pretty much his job. 5,700 hit points. Really good melee attack. His armor is low, though, so. This is why I think that he makes sort of a good unit to throw against greatswords, because he kills them so quickly, but at the same time, like, they're wasting those greatsword values. If they just had higher base values, like Forsaken, then they would have a much easier chance of beating him. Alright, so we've got Empire Knights on the flank over there. What have we got here? We got Demigriffs back there? Yep. We got Mortar. Got Mortar over there. So he's got a very thick line of just generic infantry with a back line of 2 greatswords. And this is actually a pretty smart lineup all in all, but those handgunners are going to go a little bit to waste. But we're going to just march forward as fast as possible, try and engage. I think that I can beat the Empire Knights on the flank with my guys, but I don't want to get hit by the Demigriffs is the problem, so we'll just continue advancing forward. One of the interesting things about the mortar fire that's sort of raining down on me is that it doesn't actually deal that much damage, even on direct hits. Does knock down people, though. So yeah, my opponent doesn't have actually that much heavy armor, which is really good for me. Alright, let's get you guys around like that. I think that's what we're going to do here. We'll go ahead and I think actually charge these guys towards his knights. We'll see if we can attack our halberds into them. You can see the missiles from his front line starting to come down. Now, Kolek would do poorly against halberdiers in some respects, but I don't think it would actually be that bad. But I kind of want to get in here faster just because... Oh, he decided to charge into my flank there with his cavalry, which is a good charge in some respects, but does leave him very open to my own sort of lines here. He's getting out. That's smart of him. Those hit and run attacks are quite brutal, but he's got entangled, so it's not going to necessarily be the best for him. Alright, so Kolick is getting ignored, so I'm going to just charge him right in here. Let's drop that there. Okay, so I managed to stop him from shooting at me for a little while here, but I don't want Kolick standing up there by himself like that. Alright, so let's go ahead and bring you guys over here. Alright, let's get you guys sort of around this way. Alright, we can attack those Demi-Griff Knights. Are they ones with halberds or normal ones? Yeah, these guys are normal ones. So we want to attack these Demi-Griff Knights with our Kolick, because he counts as large. Get those Empire Knights off the field if I can. I would love it if I could actually kill them. They keep attacking Kolick with their mortars, but those don't actually deal very good damage against him. Alright, we're going to get our halberds back around that way. We're attacking those Demi-Griff Knights and taking them right apart, which is really good. They're a very expensive unit. I think we've got one of their mortars tied down now. Over here we've got greatswords and swordsmen, so that's going to be, you know, we're not going to, oh, wow, okay. So we're not going to be able to beat them with Chaos Marauders, but they're sort of wasting their time fighting against them. And it gives me time to chew through his center of units there, and you could sort of see what was happening. The Halberdiers, 0 kills there. Swordsmen, a little bit better, but what was going to end up happening was those Forsaken were just going to tear apart that center line. He needed to use the greatswords against those Forsaken. The Chaos Warriors with halberds are a decent counter against something like greatswords. They're not amazing in that situation. The Knight's situation was, you know, grim for him just because I managed to support mine with halberds. He's heavily armored, so the armor penetrating was very, very useful. So it's sort of like try and get your units composition so that you've got a mix of those different types of units there. If we look at sort of how I was playing my Warriors Chaos there, you know, these Chaos Marauders, like, his halberds are such a bad value proposition against them, and that's sort of what one of his frontline units was. His swordsmen, pretty much equal against these guys, in my opinion. Swordsmen are actually probably a little bit stronger, especially considering they're at the same cost there. If we were to go over here, compare them to the Empire, let's go ahead and trash that and add in just a couple swordsmen. If we look at this, same cost unit, more armor, more leadership, I think more speed, actually. Melee attack might be in favor of these guys. But yeah, you can see that actually the Marauders, you know, they're sort of worse as a unit overall, but they're just really cost effective if the Empire is taking something like the Halberdiers. And if we look at them, we can see that their stats are pretty similar to the Swordsmen in most respects. They just cost more and have special rules that sort of give them bonuses circumstantially. If we look here, armor piercing damage is 19, which is pretty good. And if we look at this, bonus versus large of 17, which is a very, very large bonus. By contrast, of course, these guys have nothing special added to theirs. It's just that, you know, that none of that matters against that fight, Halberdiers versus Marauders. So these guys are actually very cost-effective against Halberdiers. By contrast, you know, these Chaos Warriors with halberds, I do believe they do lose against the Imperial Greatswords. We want to do a quick check over here. Chaos Warrior with halberds and comparison. So if we look here, yeah, we can see that, no, actually the melee attack and the weapon strength is a little bit higher in the Chaos Halberdiers. Same cost for the units, so very, very strong unit. That's why I do like taking these. They also have that bonus against large. They've also got the charge defense against large foes, so I find these guys extremely cost effective. It's one of the reasons why I like taking them. But I think that actually you get a larger unit for greatswords. Yeah, you get a 90 in the squad for the greatswords, so that's why that is. But yeah, you just really want to be making sure that your armored units, where possible, are against things that do not have armor piercing. Things that are armor piercing do fight against armor, and part of that is in the setup and in knowing what your opponent can field. I knew that my opponent can mostly field units with low armor for his infantry line, but I knew that he would have some armored elements, and I made sure to have armor piercing elements. I also knew that my opponent was likely to have a decent amount of armor piercing, so I was pretty happy taking these marauders just as a sponge to sort of soak up those attacks, get them entrenched, and try and mop up the rest of his units otherwise. So that's sort of how that armor and armor piercing dynamic works in this game, and it's much more pronounced and much more important in this game than it was in other games. Like, Axis had really good armor-piercing damage in Total War Attila, but it didn't really make a huge difference because usually heavily armored units could still be killed by low armor-piercing units if you gave them a little bit of time, and usually that sort of offense really sort of over-superseded the defensive values that armor gave you, whereas that's not really the case in this game. I find that the heavily armored units are really, really hard to kill with low armor penetration value weapons. So, anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable. And of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.